Welcome, everyone. This is Greg Rock, and on behalf of BPM Institute and IBM, I'd like to welcome you to today's roundtable, Continuous Improvement with BPM and Enterprise Architecture Together. As many of you know, our roundtable series are one of the ways in which BPM Institute promotes knowledge sharing and networking amongst our members and the BPM community at large. We do this through our website, our publications, our training programs, and our electronic newsletters and social network. You'll find additional information on some of that on our website. I'd like a couple quick housekeeping announcements, and then we're going to get right underway with today's webcast. These are two topics and areas that are very near and dear to our membership base and things that we get an awful lot of questions on throughout the year at the events and through the website. And we're lucky enough today to have Klaus Jensen with us, Senior Technical Staff Member and Chief Architect for IBM's SOA, BPM, EA Technical Strategy Group. And Klaus is also going to be joined later by Jasmine Basre, a Senior Product Manager with WebSphere BPM. So as many of us know, within the current business environment, it's requiring businesses to work smarter and improve coordination between planning and execution to improve their business processes and optimize costs. Klaus is going to share with us some of the findings of IBM with their clients on how they've been able to do this together with BPM and EA. And without further delay, I'd like to turn things over to Klaus Jensen.
Thank you. The topic for today is to talk about how we can combine BPM and EA for better business outcomes. The context is really, this concept of a smarter planet and the fact that people and companies and industries and systems are becoming instrumented, interconnected, and intelligent. And in fact, the world is becoming a more complex place and also a place that changes faster, where this notion of accelerating market shifts means that we do need to look much more carefully at how we do align our plans and the execution of the same, and how we lower the barriers to a digital flat world, and essentially how we can build agility and be able to adapt and respond dynamically. If we look a little more carefully at what it means to optimize business performance, there are really different aspects to it. In a lot of cases, we end up talking about only one of them. Either whether it's how businesses evolve, whether it is how people collaborate and how to maximize effectiveness and efficiency in the processes that they follow, or whether it's how technology enables agility. But in a broader perspective of working smarter, we really need to combine the three. And the agenda for today is to look at exactly that. What is it that makes us think that we need the architecture synergy between BPM and EA? What are the lifecycle of and architecture concepts that we have found work well in practical environments? And how do we suggest that you might want to think about architectural governance and collaboration across these various roles and boundaries? And finally, what are some of the scenarios that we have used to enhance our own understanding of the connection between BPM and EA and the way you can enact that in practical terms on top of roles, methods, and products. So moving on to the first part of that, the need for architectural synergy. It's a fact of life that there are actually many different ways with which you can approach business agility. And there are many different lenses you can use to try to address the challenge of business agility. One is through business strategy. You can certainly apply business process management. We've talked about for years the fact that service-oriented architecture can help you become more agile. And all of these are good. In isolation, produce valuable results. But from an enterprise holistic perspective, they're incremental results. And their current approaches that we have sort of adopted one by one are hindered by a lack of direct linkage between intent and execution. And too often we see that the intents are good, but we don't always end up executing that way. Or alternatively, we do some good things, but they didn't necessarily bring us the right step towards the future design of our business. So really to achieve transformational agility, which is this notion of continuous improvement and continuous transformation towards strategic objectives, we have to align these different approaches and enable ourselves to gain greater business control. And this notion of increasing alignment and performance for what we've labeled better business outcomes really have to do with not just technology, not just business expertise, not just methods, but really the discipline of merging all of those and the ability to tie strategic intent and decision-making directly to business execution by being able to link and correlate and collaborate on the links between business strategy and the execution of operational improvement and operational change on a SLA and BPM platform. So, looking closer into that problem space, most of you, and that's certainly been the case for a lot of companies I've been in contact with, have a business model. The question, though, becomes, that business model, does it necessarily help us close the gap between the business challenges, the business strategy, the business capabilities, and the current operating model and what we're actually capable of doing in the here and now? And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the answer is no. The reason being that the business model, or more precisely, our business architecture, is not necessarily actionable. So we need to look closer at what does it mean for an architecture to be actionable. And I claim that there are at least 4 characteristics of an actionable architecture that we need to achieve. The first one of these is that it needs to be contextual. In other words, we need to understand purposes, motivation, priorities, scope, time horizon, etc. It doesn't matter whether we have an architecture that is intended to represent a vision of the future, but not something we build in the here and now, or whether what we're looking at is an architecture for a particular solution being built in a particular project. If we don't understand that context, we will very often miscommunicate and certainly not have a clear understanding of what it is we're trying to do and how to align planning and execution. The next thing is that it needs to be collaborative. Architecture and planning and delivery are very much team sports. There will be many different roles involved in this alignment between planning and delivery that we briefly discussed. And you do need all those stakeholders to participate as applicable and provide the commitment that's necessary, and often even collaboratively evolve the architecture work products that describe what you intend to do, either as a planned future state or in the here and now in the project. And I'm going to use a number of times throughout the presentation this notion of a tribe, and the fact that you have different roles and constituencies in your enterprise that have their own language, they have their own methods, they have their own work products, and they have their own scope of responsibility. And what we need to do is to make sure that those tribes work together and function as a collective whole, if you will, as a nation for the better of the enterprise, instead of only being taking care of each their own little domain, each their own tribal concerns. That in turn means that the architecture needs to be connected, because as I just mentioned, there's going to be multiple different kinds of work products. There is going to be work products that live in different contexts, like this is a plan or this is something I'm doing in the project. And we need the ability to traceably link these various work products, these various artifacts, across purposes, domains, etc. And we also need to include appropriate levels of change and configuration management. And finally, the fourth aspect is they need to be consumable. Some people are going to accuse me of, that's probably a good architecture diagram, Klaus, but I really don't understand it, because you haven't rendered it in a form that I can necessarily consume. And that's a personal example of the fact that if you create the best architecture in the world, but you don't make it consumable in context to the stakeholders that you want to communicate and collaborate with, it's really not providing the value that you intended it to, and you're likely not going to be able to act upon it. So these 4 characteristics, contextual, collaborative, connected, and consumable, are all necessary prerequisites for actually being able to act on the architecture that you've created. What that in turn tells us on the next chart is that it really isn't just about technology. It really isn't just about assets and artifacts. It really isn't just about methods. It's about combining all of those and aligning methods, assets, and technology in order to deliver business solutions on what I could label an integrated platform. And platform here doesn't just mean technology platform. It means an integrated platform for delivering continuous optimization and agile change. And that has to do with tangible business value. It very much has to do with aligning strategic planning and solution delivery. It also has to do with enabling, as we discussed, the business users to consume and control the part that concerns them, the business context. And it certainly has to do with collaboration and following some set of common building codes. And we've talked sort of in the industry over the years about this notion of business and IT alignment. But there's something fundamentally broken with thinking about it as alignment. Because alignment indicates that we are doing business with one hand, in IT with another hand, and then upon occasion we try to align and coordinate the two. Well, what if we accept the fact that business and IT in a lot of industries are sort of unavoidably and intrinsically linked? And in fact, what we should strive for is one combined business and IT plan and one combined ability to deliver business and IT solutions. So in other words, we might want to talk about what does it take to drive towards business and IT convergence. This is one step beyond alignment where we have combined plans and combined abilities to execute change. If that's the target, then we need to look closer at what are the lifecycle and architecture concepts that would allow us to work towards that target. And if we take a sort of classical hierarchical view of the enterprise, which you will find is the mindset of many enterprise architects, it has to do with the fact that based on strategy, we create our enterprise architecture, the city plan, if you will. We do some transition planning that tells us what are the right changes to enact, and we drive projects. But unfortunately, it kind of assumes that projects just happen, and they end up creating the architectural change that we have planned. It doesn't really say a lot about how those projects execute, and it doesn't say anything about what is the feedback loop in case that the projects find out that what you had expected me to do was not necessarily possible, or maybe even they find out that there are certain other ways we can standardize the things we're doing in the enterprise, and I really like to see that as be part of our revised future vision. So there's sort of a component missing in this viewpoint that says it's not enough just to say, here's an enterprise architect to go do it. And we have to look at how do you actually enact change and what's the coordination and synergy and interaction between the planning part and the delivery part. On the other hand, if we look at something like the SOA lifecycle, which many of you have probably seen, IBM has certainly used it for a number of years. Let's be honest, some of us, or maybe even most of us, tend to think about this chart sort of from a solution perspective. We talk about modeling and assembling and deploying and managing a solution, and we don't necessarily think about what it really took to get to the point where we knew that that was the right solution or the right change to a solution to enact. In other words, this doesn't talk a lot to the planning perspective that was prevalent on the previous chart. What we really need is the ability to combine the two. So to harness change, one way of leveraging the SOA, BPM, and EA synergies is really to say that what we're looking at are two different life cycles. There is one life cycle that has to do with creating the enterprise architecture, the city plan, and deriving the desired architectural change. And there's another life cycle that has to do with how do you actually execute change. And the proper way of thinking about the sort of integration and collaboration and synergy between the two is to say that from a planning perspective, you're really setting up the targets that we would want to meet. The requirement, if you will, that everybody, not just one project, but all the projects in the enterprise are supposed to live up to. And in the other direction, you want to get feedback as to whether you're actually on track with living up to those targets, and whether you might have improvements that say, well, I found out that this might be a good way of doing things, so you may want to leverage that as part of your next revision of the enterprise architecture as future targets. There's a business-focused paper that came out recently. There's a link on this chart that points to it, that really says, here is a little more background on how you can think this way and do continuous improvement with BPM and EA together. And I'll talk to some of the parts of what that paper says on the next charts. So harnessing change, principle number one, separate enterprise planning concerns from solution delivery concerns. This is really important because the enterprise planning cycle usually works on a different time scale than the solution delivery life cycles that have to do with projects and solutions, etc. And in fact, even though in a lot of cases you have one enterprise planning cycle and one group of people, or at least a few groups of people, that regularly updates whatever your current enterprise plan is, you will have many, many parallel solution delivery life cycles. In fact, you will have one for each project or change initiative that you have in your enterprise. So the proper way of thinking about this, even though it's tempting, is really not to synchronize the two. It is to coordinate them as applicable. And the reason you don't want to synchronize is just because you change your plan, you change your vision, you change your architectural statement on where you want to be 5 years from now, that does not necessarily mean that you now have to revise 27 projects that are already running. On the contrary, you might want to leave 26 of them alone and only actually revise the targets for the 27th one. Similarly, just because you're not able to live up to a target in the project and do something else, that doesn't mean that your enterprise plan was wrong. All it means is that it wasn't possible in the here and now to actually completely live up to that plan. So what it tells us is we have to ditch our engineering mindset and stop trying to synchronize, in the same way we would synchronize the services and processes consumed within the same solution. We have to stop using that engineering mindset in the way we think about the more lightweight coordination between planning and delivery. Those two cycles simply have different scopes and purposes, and they're not linked in any linear or hierarchical fashion. They have differences in the extended timeline of the enterprise perspective and the more execution-specific context and narrow scope of any given solution delivery project. The next principle is that within each of those, we separate enterprise planning and solution delivery, yes. But within each of those, we can actually talk about both designs and constructs or models, if you will, and building blocks. And it's an important next level of understanding that says that the designs and constructs that we have in the enterprise planning space are really enterprise blueprints. They're statements of intent. They're statements of vision. They're targets that we want to live up to at some point in time. They're not the strategic guide rails that help us sort of align and orchestrate the various kinds of changes that we enact over time. The solution delivery constructs, on the other hand, are the particular things that we built within some solution delivery lifecycle. They're things that we construct, either have constructed or intend to construct. Now, it's tempting to say, how hard can that be? All we need to do is we need to do a transformation between the enterprise blueprint to the solutions that enact that vision. Well, unfortunately, in the real world, that is not the most optimal way of doing things in a lot of cases. Let me give you a simple example. If you have an enterprise blueprint that says, 3 years from now, I want to have changed my sales organization to work in such and such fashion because that's more effective from a business value perspective. And I want my sales processes to be standardized according to this blueprint that says, here's the standard way of doing sales. Now imagine how many different parts of the enterprise portfolio that actually get impacted by that 3-year vision. Now, it isn't just a matter of one process or one particular part of the organization. It is something that touches on each and every part of the sales organization throughout the enterprise, every line of business, and it touches on many, many different actual operational business processes. So you can't really say, how do you transform an organizational statement into some BPM orchestrated process that runs? It isn't really natural or possible to do that. But what you can do is you can take the organizational statement and say, well, what this vision means is that I now have a building block that says every time you do an activity of this sort, then it should probably be done by the sales advisor role. Now, that would be an architectural principle, a pattern that you want to apply not to one solution, but to all solutions. And in effect, you are extracting the building blocks, the shared building blocks for guidance and reuse that will guide and govern your solutions, not one solution, but your entire portfolio of solution delivery activities. In the other direction, you do want to be able to harvest from your solution delivery activities whether you actually have particular experiences that might make sense as input to the next round of enterprise planning. What's important to realize in what I just said is that it really means that there are two different kinds of building blocks. and people often confuse those two, and that might lead us into trouble. So the one kind of building block is a transition target that really does guide and govern any solution that is within the scope of that target. And those are really the concern of the enterprise planning tribe, and they are derived from the enterprise blueprints, the statements of vision and future architecture that guide and govern the change over time. There are other kinds of building blocks, and they're also very important and valuable, that on this chart I labeled solution accelerators. What they are things you can reuse in the solution. You can't really take a transition target and use in the solution. It does not make sense, because its context is, this is something I intend you to live up to. It's a pattern or a template or a target. You can apply it to a solution, but it's not something you can build from. The solution accelerators, on the other hand, are solution models or even executable, things you can build from, and they're the ones that you use for accelerating the construction of your solution models and constructs. So two different kinds of building blocks, and they're usually managed by different roles, different tribes in the enterprise, and you do want to make sure that you understand when you look at something whether it is the one kind of building block or the other. So in your repositories, in your registries, etc., I suggest that you may want to think about which of the work products, which of the artifacts, which of the assets actually have the role and context and metadata of being transition targets, and which of them are really solution accelerators, and make sure that everybody understands which is which and how they could, should, or should not apply each different kind. This 2x2 matrix, as we call it, you can actually expand onto the three prototypical architectural domains. You can apply this notion of planning and delivery and designs and building blocks to the business architecture, which is your IT implementation neutral architecture. You can apply it to your information systems architecture. Some would label that application architecture, information architecture, etc. We bundle them together to say that it really has to do with the business-dependent IT. And you can apply the same principles to your technology architecture, those parts of IT that sort of keep things going. And there is no particular right starting point for trying to act on this landscape. There's no one perfect approach. It all depends. If your main objective is to alleviate the fact that you don't really have an enterprise business strategy right now, well, you might want to focus on the business architecture planning part. If you, on the other hand, your major problem is that you don't really have a standardized technology infrastructure, well, then you may want to focus on technology architecture planning. And what that says is a clear understanding of what kind of change it is you're trying to enact, or what kind of vision that you currently do not have, will help you understand what part of this architectural landscape is most valuable to focus on initially. And just to give you a few examples, if your main problem is that you really want to provide operational business optimization and agility through SOA, well, you may want to focus on this kind of adoption pattern that talks about BPM powered by SOA. It focuses on SOA infrastructure. It focuses on building combined BPM and SOA information system solutions. And it focuses on the way that you can deliver optimized business processes from a pure business perspective and the organizational changes that go with that. If, on the other hand, your primary charge is to sort of achieve architectural alignment with strategic objectives across business and IT, well, then you might want to adopt an enterprise architecture adoption pattern that really talks about the enterprise planning part across all three architectural domains. And what these two charts kind of indicate is that there is a natural affinity between enterprise architecture as a discipline and BPM as a discipline. And in fact, they fill out each their portion of this architectural landscape that I described. The EA part has to do with enterprise planning and planning the future and finding out what the standards and constructs and principles are that you want to apply across all your solutions. And BPM combined with SOA is a very agile, efficient, and effective way of delivering real business value and optimized business solutions. So it kind of suggests that it's natural to combine the two. But it also suggests that there is a need for thinking in more detail about how you actually govern and collaborate that interaction across the enterprise. So governance as a concept can be done at various levels of maturity. You can certainly be very foundational about it and mostly focus on, this is an example from the SOA space, mostly focusing on creating an inventory of your current assets, establishing initial registry and repository. But as you get more mature, you really want to leverage your governing of change and the combined business and IT governance, the combined architectural and operational governance, to focus on cross-organizational optimization and adoption. And this is the place where you need to look very carefully at these different tribes that live in your enterprise. And most of you will have, what I label the urban planner tribe. The people that really do the enterprise planning lifecycle. They're the people that work with strategy, derive target blueprints and principles, and ultimately monitor architecture compliance and effective change. And they think that based on that understanding, they have some opinion on what are the right projects to run. And they have a right to have that opinion because that's the tribe that ensures that we do change in the large and drive the enterprise towards strategic objectives. On the other hand, you have a different tribe. You can call it the inspector tribe or the owner tribe or the manager tribe that really has to do with making sure that our current portfolio of processes and services and solutions run efficiently and that we maintain the integrity and performance of the current business. And they also have their strategic goals and constraints on how they think the portfolio should operate. They certainly have objectives. Just take an example. Most of us have cases where we have the EBAs that have opinions on database performance, or we can have process analysts that have opinions on how do we actually want the operational business processes to perform. In those cases, what we are projecting and want to change and want to monitor is the operational effectiveness and operational compliance. And this tribe also has a right to say, these are changes that I think are applicable, these are the projects that I think we should run. Now, you can imagine that with these two different tribes that each have their opinion on what changes to enact, unless we somehow make them collaborate and understand how they have each their role in a broader enterprise perspective, there is every reason to believe that there will in fact be conflicts as to what are the real changes that get enacted. So what we need to position is this notion that there are these three different life cycles, and we really need to collaborate across the tree. There is the enterprise planning life cycle. There is the portfolio optimization life cycle that monitors and optimizes the portfolio. And ultimately, there are the project life cycles where changes actually get enacted, where we are delivering the actual changes to solutions. And the input to those projects have to be combined from a planning perspective and from a portfolio optimization perspective. And we actually have things like analysis and design activities going on in all these life cycles. So just to say that this is an analysis activity does not necessarily tell you enough about what it really is. What you need to ask yourself is, am I analyzing for the purpose of planning the future state of the enterprise? Or am I analyzing for the purpose of optimizing my portfolio and figuring out whether I'm compliant and whether I'm living up to the KPIs and metrics I've set for the portfolio? Or am I analyzing in a project with the purpose of finding out what is the proper solution to build in that project? Three very, very different analysis activities. They all have to do with analysis. They may all work on things like process models and service models, but they are in fact not doing the same thing, and the end product does not have the same semantic implication. So we need to understand how the activities fit this landscape, and we also need to understand how the different roles, how the different tribes, how the different stakeholders in the enterprise fit this landscape. And what we've done with success with some of our IBM's clients is we've had this conversation and basically said, okay, let's understand who are the people in your organization that work with planning, that work with portfolio optimization, and that work within projects, and how do they map to this sort of standardized landscape of stuff that you do from the perspective of driving continuous optimization and agile change. And the other thing we have said is, well, given that these tribes live within different life cycles, given that they have different purposes, and given that they usually use different languages, different methods, etc., it's actually not appropriate in most cases to have one tool that they should all share. In fact, we think that there are at least sort of two different dimensions to this. The one is that says at the enterprise scale, for the enterprise planning tribes, there are usually very few architects. And you usually want one shared tool, one shared workspace that works across all the architectural domains. This would be your prototypical enterprise architecture tool. But in the solution delivery space, for the portfolio management people and for the project people, for those tribes, there are actually multiple different disciplines involved. There are multiple different roles. There will be people that work with processes. There will be people that work with information. There will be people that work with services. There will be people that work with software. And they have sufficiently different concerns that we really should provide role-specific tools and infrastructure for those different tribes. So having this conversation about, what are the tribes, how do they fit the landscape, and how does my current mix of tools or my intended future mix of tools match those different tribes and their needs within the context of the overall landscape and life cycle is a very, very important conversation to have for the purpose of being efficient and effective and driving this agile change agenda. What it talks to is the fact that it really needs to support governance and coordination at many levels. And it isn't enough to just support these roles in isolation. You actually also need to support the linkages and the interactions between things such as planning models, portfolio models, and project models. And that starts talking to sort of this notion of what kind of collaboration pattern is actually appropriate between planning and delivery. And as a simple example, I already mentioned the sales concept example. If your timeline is you want to implement that sales concept within a 3-year time frame, in all lines of business and geographies, now each of them now has 3 years to implement that new organizational model. That's mandatory. But they also need to locally instantiate the standard sales process. Why can't you just take the standard sales process and apply everywhere? Well, there might be good reasons for that, because you might have different culture, you might have different geography, you might have different legislation, or you might even have different IT support in the various geographies. So you might actually not be able to deploy that same standard process. You might need variations that apply to each of these geos. And the analogy is, if you have 10 painters that all paint the same landscape, you won't get 10 completely equal paintings. They have used the same template, the same master, if you will, but you will have 10 slightly different paintings depending on style of context. And it's the same thing with the collaboration between the enterprise planning template, standard, and principle, and the actual solutions that come out in the other end. What this suggests is that you really don't want to, as I said way up front, you don't want to synchronize these two things. You don't just want to force feed the enterprise planning artifacts as here's the thing that you need to go build. But what you do want is to coordinate the two. And you do want the bidirectional information exchange where you can say, here's the planning target, the principle, the concept, the pattern, the constraint, that applies to all the solutions, and you want to link it to the solutions that actually that particular principle or constraint or target applies to. So there are some key enablers here that have to do with ownership, visibility, relationships, context change, etc. It all correlates back to this notion of what is it that makes an architecture actionable. The collaboration pattern you probably want to strive for is something like this, where you've got the planning tribe that continuously sets up the city plan. They set certain targets, building codes, if you will, that apply to one or more delivery initiatives, which are also continuous. It can be things like building a skyscraper, to use the city analogy. When those delivery teams have done what they think they could do, or somewhere in between, well, what you want is their feedback on how well did you comply to the target. And possibly you want to get their input on an improved target. And what's important to understand is this is not the usual parallel development synchronized engineering pattern. No, what it is a lightweight coordination where, in fact, the feedback and update doesn't necessarily automatically update the planning targets. In most cases, it actually won't. But you need the planning people to look at what the feedback was and then make a judgment call as to whether they actually want to update the enterprise plan, the enterprise vision, the enterprise targets, or not. In the broader scope of things, what you really want is to optimize your business performance and your business services. And you want to move beyond alignment and synchronization to this conversion of business and IT. And what that means is you need to balance the re-engineering of your business, the change in the large, the drive towards strategic change and strategic business value with the continuous optimization of your current business. And that maps very nicely to this notion of the fact that there is a planning life cycle. there is a portfolio optimization lifecycle, and both of those serve as the foundation for the smart enterprise and the agile and continuous optimization that happens over time. So that was sort of the architectural and conceptual story. And now over to Jasmine, who will talk a little bit about the actual scenarios that we work with in more detail.
Great, thanks, Klaus. And what we'll go through now is just some key benefits of linking these approaches of enterprise architecture and BPM together, as well as some key scenarios that we've enabled in our products to really help drive some of those benefits and realize some of those benefits within an organization. If you really look and you think about what you're trying to do with the coordination of enterprise architecture and BPM, if you look at it from an enterprise architecture point of view and we think about what Klaus was saying around the planning and the blueprints that are available as part of enterprise architecture, then we can really drive some benefits of linking our business process management sort of solutions with enterprise architecture around really getting this sort of idea of being able to get templates and sort of best practices and really understanding the best way to optimize our business processes from, approach where, a lot of sort of templates and blueprints have already been created and the organization has done some of that research and understanding, what is good enterprise architecture and how that can be applied within a particular organization. And then, those models are available as part of a starting point for any sort of BPM implementation. If we look at it from the BPM lens and some of the sort of benefits that we can get from applying an enterprise architecture approach to BPM, it really is looking at ensuring that whatever sort of BPM solution that we implement, it is adhering to the right practices around implementation. So whether you're using, the right level of data application process, et cetera, that you're adhering to those enterprise architecture principles that have been assigned up front. And you can see here, we can then validate that solution against what has already been created within the enterprise architecture. So there's a lot of benefits to be gained both within the EA world and the BPM world around, applying these approaches together. Now, if we look in all practicality of how we can do this, if we look, as Klaus mentioned, it's not about, keeping everything in sync in perfect unison at all times, but it's applying at the right times the ability to link together these enterprise blueprints and architectural blueprints and process blueprints that are really defined in the enterprise architecture, then down to what we're defining in the process world in BPM, and linking those two realms together to really achieve some of those benefits we talked about. And then even vice versa, as I'm creating my process architecture, my process models, linking those back to core aspects of my enterprise architecture to really do some of that impact analysis and really understand how a business process is affecting or is affected by the enterprise architecture. And you can see what we're trying to do here is, this is very people-centric. It's bringing together those tribes that Klaus mentioned in really being able to communicate using standard-based approaches such as models and blueprints to really do that level of communication. And then, having these relationships and not forcing tools or technologies to these different tribes, but keeping them comfortable within the tools and technologies that they're used to, but then providing strategic linking across those tools so that they can get that cross domain visibility of what's happening both in enterprise architecture and BPM. And so you can see here that sort of lightweight linking approach really allows for some of those benefits to be realized very quickly and without, I would say, a lot of real kind of domain changes between the two tools or two technologies or two domains, so that an enterprise architect can do what they're comfortable with and a BPM process analyst or a business analyst can really stay comfortable in the tools and technologies that they're used to. Now, if we take a little deeper look at the scenarios, what we've identified are sort of three key scenarios that we've enabled within our product suite is really around looking at what we have in terms of Rational Software Architect and Webster Business Modeler is being able to do, BPM with EA principles. And so that's really saying, I'm starting with defining my process models and looking at my processes from a BPM point of view, defining all the roles, organizational units, all of the services that are part of that business process, and really defining that business process end-to-end from an implementation point of view, and then going back and saying, how is that business process affected by the enterprise architecture? Which parts of the enterprise architecture is that business process leveraging so that I can understand how it can be standardized, how it can leverage reuse across the organization so that I can gain some of that benefits of BPM and EA together. Another sort of key scenario is what we call EA governance, and that's really applying EA principles to the definition of a BPM process. So it's really starting at the EA world and saying, here are some of the standards and blueprints that we have in enterprise architecture. How can we then use those to assemble a BPM process for implementation that really adheres to those principles and again apply some of those benefits of reuse so that we can say, here's what's available within the enterprise. How can we leverage those to really create and link to good enterprise architecture approaches? In both of those scenarios that I just talked about, we would use a lightweight linking approach, and that was where we would link, artifacts from, for example, Webster Business Modeler to Rational System Architect to really link together, things like, a role defined in Webster Business Modeler is linked to a role defined in the Enterprise Architecture, Rational System Architect domain, and really linking those together and saying that they do mean the same things and they do apply to the same things, and we can sort of see where it get impact analysis, see things where they're used across both of those domains. And so that's really leveraging that linking approach. Now, sometimes you want to be able to jumpstart your development. And so rather than just linking, you may want to actually read and understand what's in one of those domains and clone it and create a copy of it and reuse that as part of that other domain. And the reason that we say that it's a clone rather than just an exact replica of what's in those domains is because this really allows you to be able to make it as part of that domain rather than an exact replica. So let's say, for example, I do take a service definition that's defined in the enterprise architecture domain. I can then create a clone of it and then leverage it as part of the BPM process. And as I'm creating it as part of the BPM process, I'm not bound just by what I've imported in or what I've cloned or copied in. I can actually start to morph it into the best service possible for that BPM process. And that way, if there are changes that I need to push up to the enterprise architecture, I can then start to apply the BPM with EA scenario because of that cloning process. So again, we have sort of three key scenarios that we look at in sort of linking BPM and EA together. And that's really, BPM with EA principles, getting reuse from the enterprise architecture and being able to link what we've defined in our BPM processes to enterprise architecture. EA governance, really starting out and understanding, what's part of the enterprise architecture that's available to create BPM processes. And then really being able to jumpstart BPM development by cloning aspects of the enterprise architecture and reusing those as part of the BPM implementation. So those are three key scenarios that we have actually enabled in the IBM portfolio across Webster Business Modeler and Rational System Architect. With that, I'll hand it back to Klaus to wrap up.
Thank you, Jasmine. And just to wrap up, as Jasmine just said, we already begun, from an IBM perspective, building this collaborative platform for linking and synchronizing and leveraging synergies between things like SLA, BPM, and EA. So we committed to providing this kind of technology foundation that really does integrate SLA, BPM, business events, business rules, analytics, EA, etc. We're certainly also working on previous solutions, and we have a lot of experience in services, etc. But the point of all of that is to say what we're trying to do is enable all of you to break down the silos and embrace this dynamic business network, this collaborative landscape of the various tribes that hopefully will come together to become a nation for the benefit of your enterprise. And we have actually, from that perspective, as you can hear from Jasmine's scenario examples, standards like BPM and 2.0, yes, they're important. I mean, they're important for the cloning scenario where you need to exchange things like process models in a standardized fashion. But the ability to lightweight link in different kinds of artifacts in different domains is as important, or in many of these scenarios, actually even more important. So we kind of have this motto that says we need to stop copying, because every time we copy, we break the rule of an actionable architecture. Remember, to be actionable, the architecture has to be contextual and collaborative and connected and consumable. And we lose all of that if we just copy artifacts by import-exports between tools. We really need to stop doing that and start linking between different tools that need to collaborate where applicable, as described in scenarios that Jasmine just went through. So, if you want to learn more about that, there are some white papers we've written. There are certainly case studies we've had on how you can go about doing BPM. We've done some studies on what does it mean to maintain business integrity and performance. Or ultimately, obviously, you can also contact an IBM representative to schedule a discussion or a BPM discovery session, or let us show how BPM and EA together can help you achieve business agility and better business outcomes. So that was really our story for today. Thank you.
All right, Klaus, thank you very much. And I especially wanted to thank you for providing our members with a great context for the convergence of the different architecture disciplines that are going on out there. It is a point of a lot of confusion as folks try to coordinate these different efforts together. And also wanted to thank you for sharing your experiences from IBM's SOA Foundation team as well as from the WebSphere Foundation Architecture Board. And Jasmine, thank you very much for the scenarios that you provided. I think those are real timely, and also for tying those back to some of the specific tools within the WebSphere Solutions area. We have an awful lot of folks in the community that are users of Modeler and Rational and the different WebSphere tools. So it always helps to give our members some context to some of the enabling technologies that are there, as well as some of the best practices you talked about. I'd like to first thank IBM not only for hosting for today's roundtable, but also for their ongoing support of the community in general. That enables us to bring content and do the various things that we do out to our members. So I'd like to thank you both for that very much. As Klaus mentioned, there's a number of white papers both on the IBM site and on BPM Institute. And for those of you that are lucky enough to be out on the West Coast at the end of June, IBM will be hosting a half-day innovation workshop on June 30th during Brainstorm San Francisco that runs June 28th to July 1st. And with that, I'd like to wrap up today's webcast. And again, Klaus Jensen and Jasmine Basre with IBM, I'd like to thank you both very much for your expertise and to thank our members for their time. And we look forward to hosting everyone at an upcoming roundtable. Bye-bye now.